My name's David Lyon. I'm talking to you from Queen's University, where I direct the Surveillance Studies Centre. I'm just reading the brilliant book by Glenn Greenwald, No Place to Hide, on the Snowden revelations. Now, the revelations from Edward Snowden are telling us a lot of important things about surveillance in the 21st century. The discoveries that we have made through those revelations is that the National Security Agency in the United States and its various partners around the world are engaged in warrantless mass surveillance, each of which are very important words here: warrantless mass surveillance. And this is being done using the internet and under the sign of security, more particularly the sign of national security. Many ordinary everyday items, such as text messages, for example, are now subject to the eyes of the surveillance state, as we might call it. This surveillance state works with internet companies in order to obtain data, and more importantly, what are known as metadata. Those data about the data, the identification of the machine from which the information was gleaned, the timing and the duration of the call or the messaging or other interaction. Such metadata are increasingly important and very significant for identifying and giving particular kinds of details about individuals. And there's also, we discover from the Snowden revelations, intensive and extensive collaboration with foreign agencies, especially those within the so-called Five Eyes, various communication security establishments. There is also spying on allies, and there is commercial espionage. To many of us, this seems like surveillance out of control, and certainly in comparison with what was known until a few years ago, it certainly does appear to be surveillance out of control. We're witnessing, it seems to me, a new era of mass surveillance on innocent citizens. But we also see from this case the perils of whistleblowing, and these perils make any kind of speaking out about what is going on, whether technical, academic, ethical, or political speaking out, into a major challenge. Let me make a few comments about surveillance today. I want to use the Snowden revelations as a way into thinking about the ways in which surveillance has been developing and is developing today. So what is the backstory, if you like, to the Snowden revelations? What are the challenges to our understanding surveillance today? Serious studies of surveillance and privacy started in the 1970s, although of course there was work on such areas before then. And they examined Cold War activities in particular, and also the growth of computerization and what was happening to the world of personal data as computerization became more important within organizational practices. Leading me, my study of surveillance led me to think not only about state surveillance, but also other places, other areas of life. So workplace surveillance, consumer surveillance, the surveillance of traveling public, criminal justice surveillance, all these kinds of things were also very important in the work that I was doing from the 1980s onwards. But while all these other kinds of surveillance proliferated, state surveillance never went away. It just did not dominate the ways in which surveillance and privacy studies developed over those decades. Once clear distinctions could be made between mass and targeted surveillance, but that very distinction, with what we know now, is in question. Why? Well, a very important factor. Because the internet, where so much happens in our everyday lives, so many transactions, so many interactions with others that connect our lives, that has become something that is actually the vehicle of surveillance. And that's tremendously significant, and that has only been amplified in recent years by the growth of things like social media. At the same time, an important shift has occurred from surveillance as a discipline that affects one in particular places to surveillance as control through data. This happens subtly in very many ways, from loyalty cards in supermarkets to identifiers used for health services, for example. This is a post-Orwellian world of invisible, ubiquitous surveillance, in which, as Glenn Greenwald says, there is no place to hide. Everyone is touched by mass surveillance. We can't evade surveillance and its implications. We're transparent in everyday life as never before. And all this raises new questions about the meanings of privacy, along with other concepts such as security, privacy, security, obscurity, secrecy, exposure, and so on. Technology may enable these things, but it isn't technology that is driving them. Technology is just one factor among many that are important in this equation. And, of course, some of these things are allowed by law and by the activity of government institutions. So there are deep issues at stake here. In a sense, as we look back, we see the ways in which certain crucial concepts have become important. And I think one of those crucial concepts is information, and how that has been treated differently over recent decades, and indeed since the middle of the 20th century. Information is a tremendously important concept, and it's one whose meaning has changed. Indeed, the very definition of information was changed and became grounded in an idea of information that had to do with its being quantifiable and commodifiable during the 1950s and 1960s. So information is important. Of course, by the 1980s, there was also talk about information society, the sense that somehow information had become so important that it was central to the way in which we would understand a society sociologically. There was a lot of hype there, but information has certainly become socially, politically, economically, culturally very important indeed. Information has capacities that help it to function in the ways that the original founders of the internet hoped, towards greater cooperation and greater connectedness in new forms of communication. But the internet was also born out of Cold War technologies, and it also allows old practices of what we might call state snooping and the pursuit of protesters and dissidents to be technologically enhanced. Colonialism is important here, as well as the Cold War. There were various post-war alliances and strategies that were also important in the development of surveillance. The unconstrained use of surveillance by the NSA is the particular thing that the Snowden revelations tell us all about. But this itself also has connections with other things, like the ways in which government activity increasingly occurs today on what we might call neoliberal lines. And this, among other things, makes the idea of low-cost surveillance that is also high-yield a very attractive option. It also squares with the idea that has become increasingly important in social and public policy generally, that it's not so much the causes of some phenomenon that need to be explored. I'm thinking, for example, of urban crime and other things like that. It's not so much the causes that need to be explored as the consequences that need to be controlled. And there again is another way in which surveillance has increasingly tilted towards the idea of controlling consequences rather than exploring and being interested in the causes. We also see ways in which the surveillance systems set up for one purpose end up being used for another. That happens very often, and increasingly so. And we often refer to this as mission creep or function creep, as surveillance used in one area develops for uses in another. And so we have entered a realm around the idea of information that has actually produced a kind of paranoid politics, as Richard Hofstadter used to call it. And this affects us in the ways in which our everyday lives are surveilled. And so I would say that the struggle for the internet is reaching a new phase. It's not that there haven't been struggles in the past. I remember a time before there was any commercialization, for example, on the internet. So there have been previous struggles. But the struggle for the internet is now entering a new phase, and we see it very, very clearly lit up by the Snowden revelations. Let me also suggest to you that the Snowden revelations are showing us certain things about the ways in which surveillance is developing that relate to broad trends. In the research group of which I'm a part, that is called the New Transparency, we have just produced in early 2014 a new piece of work, a book that is called Transparent Lives: Surveillance in Canada. And it's about 9 key trends in surveillance today. They apply in any country around the world, but of course surveillance will develop in different ways depending on cultural circumstances, historical background, particular political collusions, and so on. And so our surveillance in Canada is something that has Canadian illustrations with it, but refers to more general trends. Anyone can find that work. It's available in French and English at the moment, and it's also available as a free PDF online. You can find the details at www.surveillanceincanada.org. surveillanceincanada.org. And there you can see what those trends are from our new team product. However, what I want to suggest is that many of those trends are visible in what Snowden has been revealing over the past months since June 2013. One, data from the body, data emanating from the body, data that relates to body parts or views of the body or aspects of what the body produces. From facial recognition through fingerprints and so on and so forth. These are increasingly also obtained from devices that are embedded in everyday life environments. We use our smartphones. I call these things PTDs, and we carry PTDs with us everywhere. PTD stands for Personal Tracking Device, and they're marketed as smartphones, but really they are personal tracking devices as well. We don't think about them in terms of their capacities to log our activities, to time our texts and our calls, and to note our geographical position, but that's what they do. Secondly, we discover there's a convergence between public and private agencies. This is another key trend that is discussed in the Transparent Lives work. A convergence between public and private agencies such that today we frequently don't know who is watching us. Is this a government agency, or is it a commercial agency, or is it two working together? Is it Facebook? Is it Google? Is it the NSA or its equivalent in other countries? Or are they working together in a loose liaison? These are very good questions, and it's harder than ever to know who is really behind the surveillance that we are considering. Then, of course, these things also happen in a globalized fashion. They are happening in similar ways, as I already mentioned, all around the world. Security and social media-driven surveillance occur in often parallel ways with cultural distinctives in different countries around the world. Many factors are in common, and there are just 2 or 3 that I've mentioned that relate to the Snowden revelations. Several of the others in that work also are shown in quite clear relief in the Snowden revelations. I want to make a comment about the relevance of what we might call data doubles. These are the digital personae that accompany us now through life, and they are our equivalents, if you like, in the digital world. The data double is that collection, that profile of us that is gleaned from everyday transactions and communications, details of our lives that may seem very trivial and insignificant, but taken together are tremendously important. Using statistical and software techniques, these can form a picture of any given human being. Now, we may think that what kind of toothpaste we buy or what bus we caught and those kinds of details are pretty insignificant. And taken on their own, of course, they are. However, put them together and a composite picture can be built up. Daniel Solov talks about it in terms of a Seurat painting. So pointillisme is the name of this, where you have lots of tiny dots that, if you look at a small corner of the painting, don't give you much sense of what it's all about. But if you stand back and see how the dots are connected up into an overall portrait, you can begin to recognize the image that is there. So data double has that kind of meaning of that parallel world where there is, as it were, another person or persona that resembles us in some ways, and certainly which is taken very seriously by those who are engaging in surveillance practices. However, at the same time, data doubles now takes on a new meaning. With the Snowden revelations, we're made acutely aware of the ways in which surveillance is growing exponentially. So data doubles is something that happens with greater and greater frequency. At an accelerating pace, data is doubling. But of course, big data is not only about the size of the data, it's about how those data are being analyzed and what sorts of techniques are being used, what sorts of algorithms are involved to make big data what it is today. Of course, there's a lot of hype there, much is claimed for it, but the techniques of big data are certainly being used extensively in the field of surveillance today. Not just as a matter of quantity, as I say, big data involves various kinds of searches, aggregations, cross-referencing of data. And more frequently, those data are sought first. They are collected before it's clear what they're going to be used for. And this reverses the conventional method of having some idea of what you want data on and then going looking for specific data that relates. It really reverses that equation and raises all sorts of questions again about how those data are being collected and for what purposes. Big data practices are seen in the way that social media works, in the kind of state surveillance that we're talking about everywhere. I made a comment earlier about privacy, and I want to come to an end by talking more about privacy and considering how privacy relates to political activity. So much concern about Snowden revelations is couched in the language of privacy, and this is quite appropriate, and it's very important. The concept does indeed mobilize all kinds of questioning of what goes on in the world of surveillance today. Privacy is an essential component of democracy. It's a very important component of living a dignified and decent human life. It's also possible, just as it's possible to criticize the concept of surveillance, to criticize the concept of privacy and to raise questions about it. Julie Cohen, for example, in a recent book on configuring the network itself, has shown how very often the concept of privacy that we use is rather abstract and disembodied. And this means that we really need to do new work on thinking about more embodied and concrete senses of what privacy is all about. about, and how it can be related, of course, to our social lives and not just to an individual life. The idea of trying to understand the social dimensions of privacy has been going on for a long time. Indeed, Alan Weston, frequently regarded as one of the founders of contemporary privacy discourse, started out by looking at some very social aspects of privacy himself. However, for some, that side of privacy has slipped into the shadows, and sometimes, as I say, the abstract and the disembodied is taken to be rather more important than it should be. George Orwell, the writer of 1984, would have written about all manner of things that relate to privacy, and of course many think of his work in 1984 as relating to privacy, but in fact he spent more time thinking about democracy and what he called decency, or what I would call human dignity. So there are large questions about dignity and decency that are in Orwell's work. I think he was asking the right questions, even though, of course, he could have had no idea about social media and the internet, about commercial surveillance, and so on and so forth, that had developed since 1947-48. I think there are three crucial issues here. One has to do with democratic participation versus the chilling and self-censorship that may be seen, for example, with the PEN writers who signed a petition in November 2013. It also became clear that these writers from around the world were also facing increasing difficulties in actually doing what they believed was right and speaking out. And so it was revealed through a survey at the time that a large number of writers were now self-censoring and were withdrawing from some stories that they no longer wanted to be associated with because of the fears and the concerns about their involvement in such writing. So, democratic participation versus chilling and self-censorship. Social justice versus categorical suspicion is a second area that I think is tremendously important. And here I should remind you that surveillance always sorts between different categories of population so that the different groups can be treated differently. And this applies to any kind of surveillance, especially those that are today computer enhanced. But in fact, the social sorting dimensions of surveillance have been clear for a very long time, long before computers were ever dreamed of. The categories that are created, especially by state surveillance that we're seeing at the moment, have always led to a situation in which dissidents and those who are already in marginalized groups bear the brunt of the consequences of that surveillance. No wonder Snowden himself had to seek refuge and is hunkered down in a bunker in Russia right now. At the same time, this process helps to create complacency among those who don't yet feel the force of surveillance in this way, even though no one may, with impunity, imagine that because they have nothing to hide, they have nothing to fear. Then the third important feature that I think we should mention is the idea of human dignity over against overexposure. For much of human history, it has been possible to negotiate, and often successfully, the amount of information that is available to others about ourselves. Now, overexposure from mass surveillance means that we're always unsure about who knows what about us, why, and what the consequences of their knowing will have for our own lives and for those those who are connected with us in the same groups and, if you like, categories as us. This Kafkaesque situation produces fear and, in turn, suspicion of others. And it does nothing to promote human dignity, it does nothing to promote the common good and human flourishing. So, in the end, I think the sorts of questions we have to ask are about what sort of society we want, what is the common good in this context? How do we flourish as human beings in the context of a world that seems to be over the top in mass surveillance, in warrantless surveillance, and that is picking up details of our everyday lives in ways that are highly consequential, especially for those who are already marginalized? Where do we go from here? Well, I think there are many ways forward. In the workshop that followed the launch of our book, we were discussing this very question. Where should we go? And we concluded that we need to work at multiple levels, educationally, in politics, in technological development, the development of technologically responsible citizens. That we need to think about young people and multi-generational or intra-generational ways of developing strategies for working with information in the realm of the internet and social media. We need to know why it is that people comply with surveillance in particular ways. I have views on that I'm not going to spend time on just now. We need to distinguish between direct harms of surveillance and the more difficult to define and discern chilling effects of certain kinds of surveillance today. As I say, the data deluge, if you like, in the realm of mass surveillance leads to large issues of privacy, human flourishing, of human rights, and so on. We urgently need to establish among those who are doing the surveillance, who are engaged in surveillance practices, in these new data-dependent, big data-dependent practice ways in the world that is dominated by fear of terrorism, that is developing a sense, without a definition, in fact, of national security and its top priority for many governments. We need to develop over against this a sense of what sort of society we want, to establish accountability, to establish proper forms of oversight, to encourage among those who are engaged with the internet, social media, with new forms of information. We need to encourage engagement and not apathy. So the Snowden revelations show us an awful lot about contemporary surveillance situations. And it's into this world that we have to develop our arguments, not just as academics, but as citizens. And indeed, I hope that what I've said indicates that there are ways in which our lives as citizens and academics are closely bound up with each other, that we have responsibilities to be public intellectuals and to share our ideas, to look at the consequences of various kinds of strategies in the world of surveillance and the development of new understandings of privacy. And we need to, together with others, work towards situations where we can really debate what counts as a situation of human flourishing, where we can contribute to the kind of society that in our hearts we would really prefer to see. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to further discussion on these tremendously important topics. Thank you very much.